Come on, old man, don't die in my car. David Carter, a struggling delivery driver, didn't hesitate when he spotted an old man half buried in the snow on a brutal winter night. Choosing to save a life instead of making his urgent delivery, he knew he was risking his job. But he never could have imagined how much that decision would cost him. The very next day, a phone call came that would change everything. The night was brutal. Snow pelted against the windshield of the delivery truck like tiny frozen bullets, the wipers struggling to keep up as David Carter tightened his grip on the wheel. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. He had less than 15 minutes to make this last delivery, an urgent shipment for a high-profile client. And if he was late, the company could lose the account. Worse, he could lose his job. His boss had been riding him hard lately, already docking his pay last month for missing a deadline by mere minutes. No excuses, Carter. You're either reliable or you're out, the man had said, his voice flat, unforgiving. And tonight, with the storm raging outside and the roads nearly invisible beneath a thick sheet of ice, David could already feel himself losing this battle against time. His eyes flicked to the GPS, just 8 miles to go. If he kept a steady pace, ignored the weather, and didn't hit any roadblocks, he might still make it. But then, as he rounded a bend on the desolate stretch of highway, his headlights swept over something. No, someone, lying half buried in the snow near the side of the road. David's breath hitched. His instincts screamed at him to keep driving. He couldn't afford a delay. He couldn't afford another pay cut. Hell, he could barely afford rent as it was. But something about the way that frail, crumpled figure looked, the unnatural stillness, the way the wind whipped against the thin fabric of a coat that was nowhere near warm enough for this kind of cold, made his stomach twist. David clenched his jaw, debating. His rational side told him that this wasn't his problem. He didn't know the person. He had a job to do. He was barely scraping by himself. How could he be expected to save someone else? But then, another thought crept in, quieter but stronger. What if it were me? What if I were out there, freezing, slowly slipping away while cars passed by, their drivers deciding that I wasn't their problem? A curse slipped from his lips as his foot instinctively hit the brake. The truck skidded slightly before coming to a stop. He threw it into park, grabbed his gloves, and pushed the door open, the icy wind immediately cutting through his jacket like a blade. Shit, he muttered under his breath as he trudged toward the figure, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. Up close, the situation was worse than he'd thought. It was an old man, his skin almost gray from the cold, his eyelids fluttering weakly, barely clinging to consciousness. His coat, if it could even be called that, was soaked through with melted snow, his thin fingers curled inward, stiff with the onset of frostbite. David crouched down, shaking the man's shoulder. "Hey, can you hear me?" No response. The man's breath came in short, shallow puffs, barely visible in the frigid air. David's heart pounded as he assessed his options. He could call for help, except his phone had no service this far out. He could flag down another car, but he hadn't seen another vehicle in over 20 minutes. And the way the storm was picking up, there probably wouldn't be another one anytime soon. That left one option. Bracing himself, David slid his arms beneath the man's frail body and lifted him. The weight was almost nothing, the man's frame shockingly light, as if life had already started slipping away from him. Time wasn't on their side. David hurried back to the truck, practically throwing the passenger door open before carefully easing the man inside. He slammed the door shut behind them, sealing out the worst of the wind, then cranked the heat up to max. "Come on, old man, don't die in my car," he muttered, rubbing his gloved hands together before reaching for the thermos of coffee in his cup holder. He unscrewed the lid, letting the steam rise between them before pressing the warm metal to the man's lips. "Drink." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, ever so slightly, the old man's lips parted, allowing a small sip of the scalding liquid to trickle into his mouth. David waited, watching for any sign of improvement. But the man's eyes remained dull, unfocused. He was still barely there, his breathing weak and uneven. "Damn it," David whispered, exhaling sharply as he stared at the man slumped in his passenger seat. "What the hell am I supposed to do now?" Then, the old man stirred, just barely, and a whisper escaped his cracked lips. "Home. Ugh." David leaned closer. What? Home, the man repeated, his voice barely more than a breath. Number 42 Willow Street. That was all he managed before his head lolled to the side, unconscious once again. David's stomach dropped. Willow Street. That was nowhere near his delivery route. In fact, it was in the opposite direction. For a moment, the weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical force. If he went to Willow Street first, he'd be late. Too late. He could already imagine the angry email from his boss. The cancellation of the contract. The inevitable, crushing realization that he'd been replaced by someone who had chosen their job over some random stranger in the snow. David closed his eyes for a second, exhaling slowly. Then, without another thought, he shifted the truck into drive and turned around. The delivery truck rumbled through the snow-covered streets, its headlights slicing through the swirling flurries that thickened with each passing minute. David's grip on the wheel was tight, his knuckles stiff from both the cold and the weight of his decision. The route to Willow Street was taking him further and further away from his delivery destination, each mile putting a wider gap between him and what little financial security he had left. He didn't want to look at the clock, but the numbers burned in the back of his mind anyway, 11:53 p.m. His deadline was slipping away, and with it, the fragile hold he had on his job. The old man beside him remained motionless, his breathing shallow, each rise and fall of his chest barely noticeable beneath the layers of blankets David had wrapped around him. The truck's heater blasted warm air into the cabin, but the man's skin still looked pale, almost waxy, as if the cold had burrowed too deep into his bones to be chased away by something as simple as heat. David swallowed hard, a quiet voice in the back of his mind nagging at him, whispering that this might not be enough. What if he doesn't make it? What if I'm too late? What if I just made the dumbest decision of my life and lost my job for nothing? He shoved the thought away, jaw tightening as he forced himself to focus on the road ahead. It wasn't about his job anymore. It was about the fact that if he'd left that man out there, he wouldn't have just been choosing work over a stranger, he would have been choosing to let someone die. And that wasn't something he could live with. The streets became quieter the closer he got to Willow Street. The businesses that had still been open downtown were now dark, their neon signs flickering off one by one. Houses lined the sidewalks, their rooftops heavy with snow, the warm glow of Christmas lights peeking through frost-covered windows. It should have felt peaceful, but all David could feel was the tick of the clock, each passing second chipping away at the last bit of time he had left to make that damn delivery. 11:58 p.m. He wasn't going to make it. A low groan came from the passenger seat, weak but audible. David's head snapped to the side, watching as the old man's fingers twitched slightly beneath the blanket. It was the first real movement he'd made in almost 15 minutes. "Hey," David said, his voice steady despite the tension gripping his chest. "You hanging in there, old man?" The man's eyelids fluttered, but he didn't respond. David exhaled, part relief, part frustration. At least the guy was still alive, but barely. Finally, he spotted the turn for Willow Street, and took it, the truck's tires crunching over fresh snow as he made his way down the road. His eyes scanned the numbers on the mailboxes, looking for 42. When he found it, his stomach tightened. The house wasn't just a house. It was a damn estate. A massive iron gate stretched across the driveway, the property itself shrouded in the darkness of towering oak trees and carefully manicured hedges now weighed down by ice. Beyond the gate, a sprawling mansion loomed in the distance, its grand windows glowing faintly against the stormy night. David had delivered to plenty of rich folks before, but this was next-level wealth. For a second, he hesitated. This didn't make sense. The man in his passenger seat looked like he hadn't had a proper meal in days. His clothes were thin, cheap, worn with age. No way in hell did he belong in a place like this. Did he? David shook off the doubt and threw the truck into park. He unbuckled himself, shoved the door open, and stepped out into the cold, his boots sinking into the snow as he marched up to the gate's intercom panel. He slammed the button with the side of his fist. Nothing. He hit it again. Still nothing. A growl of frustration slipped from his lips, the urgency of the situation coiling tight in his chest. "Somebody open the damn gate," he yelled, his voice echoing through the night. He turned back toward the truck, his breath fogging in the air as he watched the man in the passenger seat. Still unconscious, still dangerously pale, his patience snapped. "Hey, there's a man out here. WHO needs help," he shouted again, louder this time. "Open the damn gate before he dies on your damn doorstep." For a long moment there was nothing. Then movement. Lights flickered on somewhere beyond the hedges. A security camera whirred softly as it turned toward him. Then, with a loud, mechanical groan, the iron gate creaked open. David didn't wait. He ran back to the truck, pulled the door open, and hoisted the old man into his arms as carefully as possible before charging up the driveway. The snow was deep, slowing him down, but he pushed through, his breath coming fast, pluming into the cold air. Halfway to the house, the front door swung open, and a man in a black suit came rushing out. David recognized the type immediately. A professional, a man used to being in charge, someone who wasn't expecting to be woken up in the middle of the night by a stranger carrying his unconscious boss. The man's eyes widened in genuine shock when he saw who was in David's arms. "Mr. Langley." David barely had time to react before the man signaled toward the house. Within seconds, more people appeared: staff, housekeepers, security, a damn butler rushing to take the old man from David's arms. He let them, watching as they carried him inside, their voices sharp, urgent. A younger man, maybe mid-30s, sharp-dressed, his suit only slightly wrinkled from what must have been an abrupt wake-up call, came sprinting down the steps next, his expression shifting from confusion to panic when he saw the old man's limp form. "Dad." David exhaled slowly, the weight of exhaustion hitting him all at once. The younger man looked at David, wild-eyed. Where did you find him?" "Side of the highway," David said simply, his voice rough from the cold. "Half buried in the snow." The younger man ran a hand through his hair, genuine disbelief written across his face. "Jesus, we've been looking for him for 2 days." He turned toward the butler, the man David assumed had to be the head of the household staff. "Call Dr. Sullivan. Get him here now." David took a small step back, watching as the household descended into controlled chaos. Langley was whisked inside, wrapped in blankets, people fussing over him, shouting orders. No one was paying attention to him anymore. Good. That meant he could leave. He turned to head back to his truck, but before he could take more than a few steps, a voice called out behind him. "Wait." David stopped, turning to find the butler following him, his sharp, watchful gaze filled with something unexpected: respect. "Mr. Langley's family will want to thank you properly," the man said, his tone measured, formal. "May I have your name? A way to contact you?" David hesitated for half a second, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled business card from his delivery company, handing it over. The butler studied it, nodded once, then extended his hand. "Thank you," he said simply. David shook his hand, then turned and walked back into the snow. His job was done. The old man was safe. That was all that mattered. As he climbed into the truck, throwing it into reverse, he tried not to think about what came next. The missed deadline, the paycheck he was about to lose, the consequences waiting for him at work. He sighed, rubbing a hand down his face as he drove away from the mansion, watching in his rearview mirror as its lights glowed behind him like a beacon in the dark. The drive back was silent, except for the rhythmic hum of the tires rolling over the slick, frozen asphalt. David sat stiffly in the driver's seat, his muscles tight, his fingers gripping the wheel harder than necessary. His breath was slow, measured, but no matter how many times he exhaled, the weight in his chest didn't lift. He didn't need to look at the clock to know he was way past his deadline. It didn't matter if he floored it now. The delivery was late. He was late. And there sure as hell wouldn't be any sympathy waiting for him when he got back. The cold seeped into his gloves as he flexed his fingers over the wheel, trying to shake the stiffness out of his joints. His body ached, not from carrying the old man, not from the storm, but from the tension of knowing what came next. His boss, that arrogant son of a bitch, wasn't going to care that he'd saved a man's life tonight. All that mattered to him were numbers, deadlines, and profit margins. David could already hear the man's voice in his head, a sharp, irritated sneer cutting through his thoughts like a blade. "You had one job, Carter. One goddamn job. The streetlights grew brighter as he neared the industrial part of town, the neon glow of the distribution center sign cutting through the darkness ahead. The parking lot was half empty. Most of the night shift had already wrapped up, their deliveries long since completed. David pulled into the designated loading zone and cut the engine, the truck shuddering slightly before falling into silence. He didn't move. His hands stayed on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the dashboard. He knew he couldn't sit here forever. With a sigh, he reached for the door handle, bracing himself as he stepped out into the cold. The air wasn't as biting as it had been earlier, but it still burned against his skin, a sharp reminder that this was real, that he was about to walk into whatever consequences were waiting for him inside. He adjusted his jacket, rolled his shoulders, then started toward the back entrance. The moment he stepped through the heavy steel door, he felt it. The shift in the air. A few guys from the other shifts were still hanging around, leaning against the counter in the break room, their conversation dying the second they saw him. One of them, a wiry guy named Lenny, let out a low whistle. "Damn, Carter," he muttered, shaking his head. "You really screwed the pooch on this one." David ignored him, his jaw tightening as he kept walking. He didn't need to ask how bad it was. If these guys already knew, it meant his boss had made a show of it. He didn't have to wait long to confirm it. The office door at the end of the hallway swung open, and out stepped Roderick Hayes, regional manager, corporate asshole, and the one person David had no patience for tonight. The man was short, stocky, his receding hairline doing nothing to soften the permanent scowl etched into his face. He took one look at David and let out a laugh, dry and humorless. Well, Hayes said, crossing his arms as he leaned against the doorway. "Look who finally decided to show up." David clenched his jaw but said nothing. He could already tell from the smug look on Hayes' face that the bastard was enjoying this. "You know, Carter, I'd love to hear the excuse you've cooked up for this one." Hayes pushed off the doorframe, stepping closer, his voice dropping into a slow, deliberate drawl. "Let me guess. Traffic? Got lost. Maybe your truck magically broke down," he scoffed. "Because I sure as hell hope you're not about to tell me you just felt like taking your sweet time on a high-priority order." David kept his expression neutral, even though his patience was wearing thin. There was an emergency. Hayes let out a sharp bark of laughter. "An emergency, huh?" He gestured toward the clipboard in his hand. "You mean more important than this? More important than a contract worth 6 figures. Because let me tell you, Carter, I already got a lovely email from the client. And guess what? They're pissed." David swallowed back the bitter reply sitting on his tongue. He had known this was coming. It didn't matter what he said. Hayes had already made up his mind about how this was going to play out. "I saved a man's life," David said, his voice even steady. "An old man was out in the snow, half frozen to death. I stopped. I took him home. If I hadn't, he wouldn't have made it through the night." For the first time since this conversation started, Hayes hesitated. Just a flicker of something in his expression, something almost human. But then, just as quickly it was gone. He rolled his eyes, shaking his head. "Jesus Christ, Carter, you're not a damn paramedic," he said, exasperated. "You're a delivery driver. You had a job to do. And now we lost the client, and I have to explain to corporate why we're short a contract." He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You think your sob story changes that?" David set his jaw, a slow burn of anger simmering in his chest. "I think a man's life is worth more than a fucking package, yeah." For a moment, silence stretched between them. The other guys in the break room were watching now, their expressions wary. No one spoke. No one wanted to get caught in the crossfire. Then Hayes scoffed, stepping back and flipping through his clipboard. "Well, congratulations on your heroics. Hope it was worth it." He barely looked up as he scribbled something down. "Effective immediately. I'm cutting your next paycheck in half." David's stomach dropped, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He knew this was coming, but hearing it still hit like a gut punch. Hayes didn't stop there. "Oh, and before you start bitching about it, be glad I'm not firing your ass on the spot. Because let's be honest, Carter, guys like you," he smirked. "You're replaceable." Something in David snapped. He didn't even realize he'd stepped forward until Hayes flinched, just slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but David saw it. Felt it. For a second, he wanted to say something. Wanted to tell this smug, arrogant bastard exactly where he could shove that clipboard. Wanted to wipe that smug look off his face just once. But then, just as quickly as the anger had flared up, it burned out. Because the truth was, Hayes wasn't worth it. David exhaled sharply, forced his muscles to relax, and turned on his heel. "Go to hell, Roderick," he muttered, walking away. Hayes laughed behind him, but David didn't stop. He walked straight out the door, straight into the night, straight into the reality that he'd just lost half his paycheck for doing the right thing. And for the first time, doubt started to creep in. Had he just screwed himself over for nothing? The cold hit him the second he stepped outside, but David barely felt it. His pulse still pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else, the wind, the distant hum of the freeway, even the muffled laughter coming from inside the warehouse, probably from Hayes and his little circle of sycophants, reveling in his humiliation. His boots crunched against the ice as he crossed the lot toward his truck, his breath fogging in front of him in short, sharp bursts. Half a paycheck gone. Just like that. Weeks of work, overtime, exhaustion, all slashed in half with a few strokes of a pen. He could already feel the strain it would put on him. Rent was due in a few days. The gas bill had been creeping up with the winter cold. His fridge was already looking emptier than he liked. And now, just because he had the nerve to help a dying man instead of delivering a damn package, he was staring down another month of barely scraping by. Was it worth it? The question slithered into his mind before he could shove it away. It pissed him off that he was even asking himself that. Of course it was worth it. A man's life wasn't something you put on a goddamn scale and weighed against lost wages. But still, the reality of it stung. He'd done the right thing, and yet he was the one paying for it. Not Hayes, not the company, just him, again. David yanked the truck door open, climbing into the cab and slamming it shut with more force than necessary. The cabin was freezing, the heater barely making a dent in the bitter night air. He sat there for a moment, hands gripping the wheel, trying to let the silence settle him. It didn't. Instead, it just made the whole thing feel heavier. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, staring at the cracked vinyl of the dashboard, before finally sighing and reaching for the key in the ignition. But before he could turn it, his phone buzzed against the console. David frowned. Nobody called him this late. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. His first instinct was to ignore it. Probably spam. Bill collector, maybe. He wasn't in the mood for either. But something made him hesitate. A gut feeling. He exhaled sharply, snatching up the phone and swiping to answer. "Yeah," he said, voice rough from the cold. There was a brief pause, then a calm, measured voice on the other end. "Mr. Carter?" David sat up slightly, his grip tightening around the phone. "Who's asking?" "My name is Bernard Holloway. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. George Langley." David blinked. For a second he thought he'd misheard. Then the name hit him like a brick. Langley. The old man. The guy he'd dragged in from the snow. His mind flashed back to the mansion, to the butler who had taken his business card, to the son who had looked at his father like he wasn't sure whether to be relieved or terrified. David straightened in his seat, suddenly more alert. "Yeah, that's me." "Good," Holloway said, his voice smooth, professional. "Mr. Langley would like to see you." David frowned. "See me?" "Yes," Holloway continued. "At his estate. Tomorrow morning if you're available." David hesitated. Was this some kind of joke? After the night he'd had, he wasn't exactly in the mood to play along. "Listen, man. I don't know what this is about, but if it's some rich guy guilt trip thing, I don't need a pat on the back or a fruit basket. I did what anyone with half a conscience would do, and now I'm paying for it. So unless Mr. Langley is planning on covering my lost paycheck, I believe that's exactly what he intends to do," Holloway interrupted, unfazed. David's mouth snapped shut. A beat of silence passed before Holloway spoke again. "Willow Street, 10 a.m. I trust you'll be there." David exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face. He should say no. He should tell them to leave him the hell alone, that he didn't need some billionaire's pity. But the truth was, he didn't have the luxury of turning down anything right now. "Yeah, he said finally, his voice quieter now. Yeah, I'll be there. Excellent, Holloway replied smoothly. Have a good night, Mr. Carter. The call ended, and David sat there for a long moment, staring at the screen. What the hell had he just gotten himself into? The morning air was crisp, the kind of cold that bit through layers and settled into your bones, no matter how many times you rubbed your hands together. David sat behind the wheel of his truck, parked just outside the towering iron gates of the Langley estate, his fingers drumming restlessly against the steering wheel. He'd been sitting there for the last 5 minutes, trying to decide if he was actually going to go through with this. Something about the whole thing felt surreal. The night before had been one thing: chaos, urgency, instinct. He hadn't had time to think, to process. But now, in the quiet morning light, with the mansion looming ahead like something straight out of a movie, it hit him just how out of place he was. What the hell am I doing here? Rich people didn't call guys like him back. He was just a delivery driver with a bad paycheck and a worse boss. Not someone who belonged inside a house that probably had more bathrooms than he had pairs of shoes. What if this was a mistake? What if this was some kind of PR stunt, or worse, a lecture about how he should have minded his own business instead of meddling? Before he could talk himself out of it, the intercom near the gate crackled to life. Mr. Carter, came that same smooth, measured voice from the night before. Holloway, you're expected. Please proceed. With a heavy sigh, David threw the truck into drive and eased forward as the iron gates groaned open before him. The driveway was long, lined with trees whose branches sagged under the weight of fresh snow. The mansion itself loomed ahead, massive, elegant, intimidating in a way that made his stomach tighten. He parked near the front steps and cut the engine, taking one last deep breath before stepping out. The front doors opened before he even reached them. Holloway stood there, as put together as he'd sounded over the phone, tall, poised, every inch the perfect butler or estate manager, or whatever fancy title he had. He gave David a polite nod, then gestured for him to follow. David stepped inside and was immediately hit with the kind of warmth that came from a house big enough to have its own climate. The floors were polished marble, the ceiling stretched high above him, chandeliers casting soft golden light that made everything feel even more unreal. Right this way, Holloway said, leading him down a long hallway. The walls were lined with portraits and expensive-looking art, and David had to fight the urge to shove his hands into his pockets to avoid touching anything by accident. They stopped in front of a set of large double doors. Holloway knocked once before pushing them open. Inside, seated near a massive window that overlooked the snow-covered estate grounds, was George Langley. David almost didn't recognize him at first. The last time he'd seen the man, he'd been half frozen, barely clinging to consciousness. Now, dressed in a well-fitted navy sweater and slacks, he looked stronger, sharper, like someone who had never once been at the mercy of the elements. The only sign that anything had happened at all was the thin blanket draped over his lap, as if to chase away any lingering chill from his ordeal. The old man looked up, his sharp blue eyes locking onto David. Then, slowly, he smiled. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of age and experience. "Come in. Sit." David hesitated for half a second before stepping inside, lowering himself into the chair opposite Langley. Holloway, ever the silent presence, closed the doors behind them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Langley studied him, his gaze calculating, assessing. Then he exhaled a quiet chuckle. "You're not what I expected." David arched a brow. "Yeah? What were you expecting?" Langley shrugged. "I'm not sure. I only remember glimpses from that night. The cold, the truck, your voice. But my family told me what happened." He leaned back slightly, resting his hands on the armrests. "And I wanted to see you for myself." David nodded slowly, not sure where this was going. "Well, here I am." Langley's lips twitched, amused. "Indeed." He studied David for another moment before exhaling, his expression softening. "You saved my life." David shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the weight of those words. "I just did what anyone else would have done." Langley chuckled, shaking his head. "No, you didn't." There was something about the way he said it, calm, certain, like a man who had seen enough of the world to know when someone was lying to themselves. David swallowed, not sure what to say. Langley continued, "I've spent my life surrounded by men who do nothing unless there's something in it for them, who calculate every action, every risk, every favor. And yet, in the middle of a snowstorm, with a job on the line, you stopped for a stranger. You carried me out of the cold when no one else would bothered." His voice lowered slightly. "And now, because of that, you're paying for it." David's jaw tensed. He didn't reply, but he didn't have to. Langley already knew. The old man sighed, shaking his head. "I made a lot of money in my lifetime, Mr. Carter. More than any man could ever need. But I also learned something along the way." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. "The world doesn't reward kindness. It punishes it." David swallowed, because he knew that truth firsthand. Langley studied him for another long moment before reaching into the drawer beside him and pulling out an envelope. He slid it across the table. David hesitated. "What is this?" "A thank you." David opened the envelope, his breath catching when he saw the number written on the check inside. It was far more than just a replacement paycheck. This was months, no, nearly a year's worth of salary. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "I can't take this." "Yes, you can," Langley said simply, "and you will." David clenched his jaw. "I didn't do it for a reward." Langley smiled. "I know. That's why you deserve it." David stared at the check, his chest tight with something he couldn't quite name. Gratitude. Relief. Maybe something more complicated than either. After a long moment he exhaled sharply, sliding the check back into the envelope and tucking it into his jacket. "Thank you." Langley nodded once, then leaned back in his chair. "There's something else." David looked up. "Something else?" Langley's smile returned, but this time there was a knowing glint in his eyes. "How would you like a better job?" David blinked. "What?" "I need a new driver. Someone reliable. Someone I trust." Langley tapped a finger against the armrest. "You looking for a change, Mr. Carter?" David didn't answer right away. He thought about Hayes, about the warehouse, about the endless grind of a job that would never see him as anything more than replaceable. Then, finally, he let out a slow breath and smiled. "Yeah," he said, "I think I am." Langley chuckled. "Good." And just like that, David Carter's life changed forever. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.